Yeah, I think we are good. Okay, cool. We are live everywhere. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another live. This is not on Thursday. This is actually on a Wednesday. What we're going to be talking today about is first principles and diet wars. Now, there's a study that's come out. I've written a short piece on it in my blog. You can check it out if you want. Others have written far more lengthy pieces pointing out the flaws in that study, and I've come to understand that there are pretty serious flaws in that study. I'm talking about the Dave Feldman, Nick Norwitz, keto, LMHR, lean mass hyper-responder discussion, right? And I don't actually want to get into that today because I really want to remind us what we're doing here. At least, if you're watching my channel, if you're listening to my content, you should understand that this is really about first principles. It is not about diet wars. Why do I make that distinction? A diet war to me is someone saying, vegetarian diets are the best, keto diets are the best, carnivore diets are the best. And none of those are like, yeah, all of those could be true. I mean, people can get benefit from any of those things. So it can be appropriate in a certain circumstance. But the question is, what diet are you coming off of to go onto those diets? But leave all that aside. What I'm concerned with really is the question of first principles, right? And the assumption being that the diet that the human animal or any animal is meant to eat is the diet that they evolved to eat, right? So what does that mean? It means if we take, let's not talk about humans because it's extremely fraught. It's an extremely fraught discussion. Let's talk about marine mammals, right? Let's talk about dolphins, for example. Dolphins are a toothed whale. Now, if you go back in their evolutionary history, you'll find that dolphins evolved from grass-eating land mammals, right? And then they actually evolved originally in the sea, and then they came back out of the sea, and then now they went back in the sea, and now they hunt fish. That's all they eat is different species of fish, right? Pretty much, right? So we can say that an evolutionary appropriate diet for a dolphin is a diet composed almost exclusively of fish. Now, someone can show me some video footage of a dolphin eating some seaweed or a dolphin eating, I don't know, different kinds of fish like mussels and so on, shellfish. I'm sure they do that, but for most species of dolphins that I'm aware of, they just eat regular fish. They just hunt things like, medium-sized fish, not as big as a tuna, like a small tuna, that kind of size. That's what I've seen. Um, so that is an evolutionary appropriate diet for the dolphin. Now, when it comes to the question of humans, I don't know why it's more difficult than talking about dolphin evolution. Why should it be more difficult talking about human evolution? But it is. But there is very little doubt, looking at the evolutionary history of humans, that about 7 million years ago we shared a common ancestor with the species that are today primates and simians, right? These are your monkeys, these are your great apes, et cetera, right? And that common ancestor, as far as we can tell, ate certainly vegetable matter, ate largely fruits from what we can tell, right? Because of even today, we tend to have the teeth that are associated with eating fruits, right? That seems to be, without a doubt, true. Now, at some later point, much later, 2.4 ish million years ago, an ancestor of humans, but not of other existing animals, came out of the trees, right, and came on land and started to walk upright and started to walk, right, and started to scavenge at that point. At that point, we were scavenging mostly fatty bits of meat, things like bone marrow, things like brain, et cetera, right? And then eventually, another ancestor of ours, probably in the Australopithecus genus, so we're not yet in the Homo genus, we're just prior to that, Australopithecus. Um, they seem to have one of their species, or one of those species within the genus Australopithecus. They started to actually hunt, right? And they seem to hunt big animals. And in fact, when we look at later species that are in the genus Homo, so Homo neanderthalis, that's the Neanderthals, Homo erectus, which is by far the most long-lived of our ancestors. That species was around a long, long time. Very successful species, Homo erectus. And they hunted what looks like elephants, right? They hunted mastodons, they hunted mammoths, they hunted all these kind of things, right? So that is our fairly recent. Homo erectus is about 1.5 million years ago, and extremely successful predecessor, right? Even early Homo sapiens, we have very clear evidence that they were eating big animals. This was during the ice age that existed 300,000 years ago, which is roughly the time when Homo sapiens started to come out, started to evolve, right, in our anatomically modern form, right? Or even 70, 80,000 years ago, which many people, people who study the evolution of language will say that actually humans started to develop language around 70 or 80,000 years ago. Even at that time, there was still an ice age on. And that ice age was characterized by having these very large animals, and humans were hunting those large animals, right? So this is just fact, right? So from a first principles perspective, if you want to advocate for a diet that doesn't include large fatty animals in it, the onus, like the burden is on you, right? You have to prove to me that those foods are safe in the quantities that you're suggesting, right? So even in those days, this is where I might have some disagreements with the super religious carnivores. And to say, look, man, if you want to include a bit of plants in your diet, like it's not going to kill you. But I would recommend, as a matter of precaution, that you include plants in the ratio in which our ancestors were eating plants, which is very little, between 10, 20, at most maybe 25, 30%, which put us in the spectrum of what biologists and zoologists call hypercarnivores. A hypercarnivore is an animal that gets more than 70% of its food mass from meat, right? So lions would be one such. Now, I have been to the bush many times. I have seen lions chewing on grass. Fine, great, no problem. They can chew on whatever they want to. But that's not how they get most of their energy, right? Most of their energy has to come from hunting animals. So in that context, if we're looking at some of the recent findings, some of the recent debates on cholesterol and LDL and so on, it's like, dude, what is this actually telling us? It's telling us very, very little. It's certainly giving us nothing that would allow us to question that default diet, right? That evolutionary appropriate, that ancestrally appropriate diet for humans. There's nothing in the recent data that would come to question that. The only thing that the recent data might do, and I think there's lots of other data that does this even better than that data, is to say that there is no correlation between the progression of plaques in people who are suffering heart disease. And let's be honest, if you look closely, if you have a good enough microscope, all of us are suffering from heart disease. Just like if you have a good enough scanner or a good enough blood test, all of us are suffering from cancer. This is not clinically relevant. This is subclinical heart disease, right? If you have a good enough scanner, we are all suffering from subclinical heart disease. And LDL or ApoB or cholesterol or all of these things is not a good proxy for the progression of subclinical atherosclerosis. That, in my opinion, was already very clear prior to the release of the recent data. It is still very clear after the release of the recent data. And it certainly has nothing to do with like diets and so on, right? Now, what else to say about this? I mean, listen, I think there is a worry because we are living in a world that is so not natural, that is so divorced from the world within which traditional humans were living. So there are all these questions about, well, in this context, is LDL, ApoB harmful, et cetera, et cetera? And the short answer is we don't know. However, the people who are advancing that hypothesis, I would claim that the burden of proof is on them. Like, if you want to tell me that, whatever you want to tell me, if you want to tell me that eliminating meat is healthy, et cetera, you got to show me long-term studies on vegans and vegetarians showing that they have better outcomes. And we just don't have such studies. We have anecdotes, lots of anecdotes. I was recently, someone was, sometimes I love my commenters. If you'd like to comment, go ahead, go for it. But someone was going through and left like 100 different comments on the John McDougall obituary video that I did some time ago. So John McDougall is a vegan who died last year at the age of 77, I want to say. He was advocating a very extreme kind of diet, right? There's another vegan who died recently, Mango Wozniak, I think his name was. He was a fruitarian or something like this, and he died of a heart attack. His partner or wife, I don't know their marital status, I don't really care, but his partner posted that basically he died of his clogged arteries after 20 years being on a vegan diet with very, very low cholesterol, right? So all this just saying, look, forget about all the confusion, forget about all the mess. Let's focus on, don't let others do your thinking. At bottom, humans have an ancestrally appropriate diet, or maybe diets, maybe range of diets. I'm willing to concede that. But they are arranged within a very narrow spectrum. So don't outsource to your doctor or your nutritionist or whoever, your YouTube influencer or whatever. Don't outsource your critical thinking, right? Now, if you want to outsource your strategizing, so you come to your own conclusions about what you want to do largely, but the strategy of how you want to reverse disease, well, that's when you can talk to someone like me, like a health coach. Maybe we recommend supplements, although I doubt it. The only one that I really recommend is the Cerule one that's being shown now, because that's great for improving stem cell production and endogenous stem cell production. And that's something that probably 100% of us need, especially those of us over the age of, say, 40. So I have no doubts recommending that. But other things, it's like, dude, why do we want to play around with tablets and pills and supplements, all of which have fillers and so on, when we can get our nutrition from food? If we can get our nutrition from, mostly animal foods, that's how you're going to get your proper nutrition, then that's the way to do it. Now, if you have certain needs, you have certain deficiencies, you have a B vitamin deficiency and you don't like eating liver, then yeah, we're going to look at the different options. We're going to make a strategy that's specifically for you. But in general, try and think in first principles. Try and think in terms of what is the ancestrally appropriate diet for humans. Try and think of how can I get that diet? How can I get myself on that diet? How can I get myself living those lifestyles, including, by the way, things like sunlight. I'm looking out the window because it's kind of a cloudy day today, but it would be great to get, sufficient sunlight. And a lot of my clients see benefits just from deliberately adding 20 or 30 minutes of sun exposure to their routines, right? Ancestral movement as well, that's part of things. I've been talking to a coach recently who specializes in sort of primal movement patterns, which is not an area I have any expertise in, but it's super interesting, right? So anyway, these are just some thoughts here on a Wednesday. I again, don't let the noise confuse you. There's a lot of noise out there. The default is still the default. The default question is, what is the ancestrally appropriate diet that humans evolved on? And the answer is still, based on all the data I've seen, a diet of at least 70, 75% meat, and the remaining 10, 20, 30%, you can be more flexible. We recommend people not be too flexible, because if you're going to do things like eating carbs, eating candy bars with that 20, 30% or whatever it is, even eating sugary fruits, it's just going to make it much more difficult to reverse disease if reversing disease is your priority. So thanks. With that, I'll see you in the next one.